Hello, and welcome now as we come to the 32nd Sunday of the year. We really now have just 3 more Sundays this year, which our guide will be the Gospel writer Matthew. And so our reading for Matthew's Gospel today is chapter 25, verses 1 through 13. The other 2 readings, the first reading comes from the book of Wisdom, chapter 6, verses 12 through 16, and the second reading, again, of the letter of Paul to the Thessalonians, this time chapter 4, verses 13 through 18. Now, as we come to Matthew's Gospel, it is perhaps interesting to notice that the next section, namely chapter 25, from verse contains 3 parables, and there is a certain likeness to them. We will see this time we get the first of those parables, and next week the second, and then a week after the third. So there will be a sequence here of listening to them. However, we are skipping as we come to chapter 25, chapter 24, if we're looking at the whole gospel tradition of Matthew. Now, the reason for that is, and the kind of inclusiveness of this whole set of material works from chapter 24, verse 1, through chapter 25, verse 46. So there is a consistency here. And it could be really seen as breaking up into 4 kind of sections. The first section begins in chapter 24, verse 1 through 14, opens with a prediction regarding the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the signs that are the beginning of the end time. Now, partially why we're skipping this is that they were included earlier in the year at the time that we began the Advent season. We have mentioned this before, and we'll see this again this time, that the first Sunday of Advent often looks toward a future coming, that is what we call an eschatological time, a final time. And so some of the material that's found in chapter 24 of Matthew, we looked at the very beginning of this year. So all of that, again, is a little background. So that's the first section. The second section of this are a series of sayings and signs and events that talk about the coming of the Son of Humanity. And this would be in verses 15 through 31 of chapter 24. So as I mentioned, we have already looked at that. They're a little sequentially rearranged for the liturgical celebration, not following necessarily the pattern of Matthew's story. Then comes a series of sayings and these 3 parables, which all highlight the need of preparedness, of vigilance, of being ready for the end time. And as I mentioned, this would include chapter 24, verses 32 through chapter 25, verses 30. And then finally is the parable of the Last Judgment, which concludes chapter 25, and we will look at that 2 weeks hence. So all of that is, again, a little reminder. This time we look at the first of these 3 parables. This one deals with the coming of the bridegroom and the awareness and the waitingness of 10 virgins or maidens for the coming of the bridegroom. Next time we will look at the story of the talents, and then after that, the time of the Last Judgment. So those would be the 3 parables that make up chapter 25. Now, a little bit of background here. It tells the story, or the parable, that there are 10 maidens, virgins. They're not bridesmaids, although some translations have included that. That is not really what their role was. They were there to greet the bridegroom when he came to the house of the bride, who was living with her parents, to take her from there to his house and to his family. And that is the kind of sociological background for this tradition. Now, there are a couple of ways to look at this. One would be to keep in mind what we know as kind of the historical way in which marriages were arranged and celebrated. We may have mentioned this in earlier times, but it's perhaps important as we look at it this time. And there are also a number of elements within this story that, well, seem to be unrealistic or even disturbing. So the different analyses of this particular parable have taken place. What is the basic story? Just to quickly do it. There are 10 maidens who are waiting for the coming of the bridegroom. He takes his time, he delays. It is at midnight, actually, that the sound is given, the bridegroom is here, get ready to greet him. 5 of the maidens are wise, 5 of the maidens are considered to be unwise. They are quickly trimming their lamps, but the unwise discover that they don't have enough oil for their lamps, and the wise do not share with them, but tell them that perhaps they should go to the local stores and buy some. All right, they go off. The 5 wise accompanied the bridegroom. The 5 unwise, when they return, are not included. So that is basically what this parable is about. And you can see, we'll come back to this again as the point of this particular message. Be vigilant, be watchful, be ready, stay alert. All of those are really apt ways of describing what this parable is aiming at. All right, so let's start with a little bit the negative here, and then we'll move to what probably is the basic background to this parable. As I say, there are a number of elements in this story that seem unrealistic and even disturbing. And so here are some of the questions that have been raised by those who look at this with a little kind of a more jaundiced look in their eye. When the maidens go out to meet the bridegroom, where are they waiting? If they're waiting for the bridegroom, as someone who questioned this, where are they waiting for him? Okay. How have they stopped to rest? Well, is that the reason? As they're going on this to be there, have they stopped and kind of sat down and maybe even fallen asleep? Do they fall asleep somewhere on the street or at the city gate? Notice these are questions that some might ask if one looks at this story a little bit as it might historically have been setting. Why are the maidens who have extra oil so heartless toward those who have none? Shouldn't they maybe share some of their oil with those who don't? Weren't these women friends or related to one another? Are they all strange women, or are they not, because this is the way in which things worked out, really part of families that are interrelated, that know one another? Is this a cruel trick for the wise ones to send the foolish to merchants who surely know that the merchants would not be open at midnight at night to sell them oil? So that's another kind of, you can kind of see there's a little edge to these questions, but they are kind of interesting. Why are the attendants of the groom all female? Shouldn't there maybe be some male attendants to the groom? It's another question that is raised. If they are related to the groom, Why do they call the groom Lord? After all, that is a title of distinction which usually kind of sets that person apart from the others and does not indicate a relationship. And why does not the groom recognize these maidens? So all of those are kind of questions that are sometimes raised by those who look at this and say, this is really an unrealistic kind of thing. Or it leads those who read it this way to say that the whole parable is allegorically made, that we are therefore to interpret kind of each of the figures, each of the situations from a hidden, remember that's the idea of an allegory, that there's another level of meaning that lies behind. Isn't that the way we should interpret it? So that's one of the kind of critiques that take a sort of, well, let's blink our eyes and really that kind of thing could happen. On the other hand, we could say that this parable is quite realistic in what it, in the way in which it is presented and in the way in which it works. In that sense, let's remember that marriages were and we're talking about the first century time, we're talking about the world of Jesus, but we're also talking about the world of the Mediterranean region. And again, we've noticed on a number of occasions it's always important to culturally notice that reality, that it's a patriarchal marriage. That is, fathers were the basic people who kind of engineered this, although really realistically behind the father lay the mother or the wife, who also had very strong input into how things happen. So lest it be thought that it's just the men who run all of this, that really wasn't the way in which life worked. What happens at the time, now again, reviewing what we noticed earlier on when we looked at the story of Joseph at the beginning of our year here with Matthew, but going back to that, remember that the idea of the marriage took place in two stages. The first was the betrothal. The betrothal took place in the home of the bride, and that it was at that point that the parents dealt with how arrangements should be made with regard to their daughter and their son. This often may not fit so much our pattern today, did not happen because the bride and the groom were in love with one another, and that kind of romantically said one day, wouldn't it be nice if we would get married and could start a family together? That may have been, but that really wasn't the way in which things ordinarily worked. Often a bride, so we are told, got to know her husband only when she moved in with him on the actual day of the wedding. So you have the betrothal service and you have the marriage service, and in between, you remember, lies at least a year. So this would provide sufficient time for the groom to prepare a home and a place for his bride to live. Often that home was either very close to his parents' home or even within his parents' complex, and they simply had a kind of section or a room that was their own. Again, that would vary from place to place. So the deal would be struck between the parents, in this case of the bride and of the groom. Arrangements would be made, and then they would, as I say, separate. The bride would stay with her family, and the groom would stay with his. And usually there wasn't a great deal of contact, although certainly human nature could smile and say sometimes played a part, that it was not unknown that at times although that would have been a lot of kind of secretivity, if there is such a word like that took place, might have a little bump on the day of the wedding, but that was certainly acceptable and understood. All right, so the ideal marriage partner in this kind of setting would be the first cousin, specifically the father's brother's daughter, because there was a very close-knit connection between families. Now that was the ideal. We're not sure it always worked out that way, but that was the way and the pattern in which these marriages were arranged. And they were arranged under the father's powerful, as I mentioned, influence of the mother. Do not think, as I just mentioned, that mom sat or the wife sat behind and just kind of, okay, dear, do what you want. We don't think that often happened. When the partners were old enough, now this is interesting, these betrothals could happen before a marriageable age of either the groom or the bride. So these arrangements could have been made, for example, when the bride was 10 or 11. She would not be of marriageable age until 12 or 13. And we could suggest that vice versa. So although we always kind of say there's this ideal year between, it could be longer depending on when the actual marriage betrothal arrangement was made. But the idea was that once the betrothal was made, that's where the marriage was going to later be fulfilled or take place. Now, all of that, again, is important to kind of be aware of the customs and practices of arranged marriages, and that was usually, as I say, the way in which families engaged in, and it helped support and keep the families together and the bonds that united them strengthened. Now, what would happen, and here this brings us now to this parable, when the day of, or the time of the actual wedding took place, on the day of the wedding, which would take place in the home of the groom's family. See, the betrothal had taken place in the home of the bride's family. So once again, there is a sort of balancing that took place. The groom would then arrive and escort the bride, betrothed one, from her home to his home. And the virgins or the maidens were kind of the escort for this to take place. So we're not sure what the relationship of all of these women were, and maybe that questionnaire we mentioned at the beginning would have been kind of legitimate, but we're not sure. All right, so there are 10 maidens. Is this important? Well, yes, the number 10, of course, you remember, symbolically indicates fullness or completeness. So, and the likelihood of this is that these women were relatives or friends of the groom. As I mentioned, they were not bridesmaids. It means, and when we say they are virgins, it simply means that they were unmarried young women, okay? And we got to be careful because in our language, virgin has a more strict meaning, and that certainly may have been the case, but the understanding of virgin was simply, to be fair here, an unmarried woman. So at that point, had no attachments to any other family except to her own family. Now, when does the bridegroom arrive? He arrives at midnight. Is this important? Why is midnight mentioned? Well, because in many, and again, there's a biblical background here. Remember, we mentioned as we've been going through it this year, how often Matthew is concerned with the tradition of the past. Midnight turned out to be Christic moments in important events in Israel's history. So, for example, it was at midnight that the angel of the Lord passed through the house, over the houses of the Israelites as they were in Egypt, and those who were door frames who were marked with the blood of the Lamb were spared, where those who were not, the firstborn of all Egypt was struck down. That happened, that moment was midnight. Now in the New Testament, there's the story of Paul and Silas, who were released from prison in the city of Philippi at midnight. And that was the hour when Paul later on is on a trip. This is in the Acts of the Apostles, and the wind is blowing and the storm is happening, and at midnight he notices that there is land and that they safely sail there and land. So is that part of how the understanding of midnight should be interpreted? Well, could be. All right, so at midnight the cry is made, the bridegroom is here, the women get up and dress their lamps. Now the word lamp. There are two different understandings of lamps that might be thought here. One is a lamp that would be considered something like a torch. Hold it up so that you can kind of lead people and people could see. And therefore the lamp would be flaming, would be probably the best way of describing this. That goes back to one of the important stories in the book of Genesis, where God makes a covenant with Abraham, and he splits a number of animals and lays them apart, and then down the middle comes the flame of God to establish this covenant with Abraham and with his family, and of course with all of Israel. And lanterns, when we think of carrying the lanterns, usually had little fires in them, little flames. So that's one way to look at what they trimmed. Another would be, and I have here a little example of that. This, of course, is a very miniature model of what we're looking at, would be an oil lamp. The oil would be placed inside, and little flame would come out here. And these were basically used in homes for, like, maybe we would turn lights on. Well, these kind of lamps would be used for home use. There is a parable, you remember, in Luke's story, where a woman searches her house looking for a lost coin, and she uses a lamp to kind of do that, much like we might use a searchlight today if you want it in that case. So was this the kind of lamp that we're talking about, or were they torches? Well, the two different Hebrew words and Greek words here, depending on which translation you look at, determines what kind of lamp it was. Now, all of that, again, is background, but it makes it interesting, does it not, to listen to this. So what did they do? They put their lamp in order. Now it says it trims it, okay? What does that mean? Well, if it were a lamp like this, they would have to trim off all the burnt kind of stuff that gathered around the top of it. They would have to fill it with oil. Oil would have gone into a kind of hole like this. And sometimes they would put a rag soaked with oil in there so that would help keep it burning longer and more carefully. So all of that would be the process of trimming the lamp so that it would provide the light. And you can see it. This was done for very practical reasons. After all, if he comes at midnight, I suspect it was kind of dark then. And remember that they don't have street lights and headlights and all of that stuff that we do. So if you're going to have a procession, this is the way you're going to do it. Now, the 5 wise are ready to do this, and someone has called them the dull-witted, okay? All right, maybe that's a kinder word for them. By the way, these attendants would have probably been young teenagers, or do we call them young adults today? And 5 of them clever, 5 of them dull-witted. Now, why would those who have oil not give to those who have not? Well, because in order for the adequate transfer of the bride from her home to the home of the groom, you would need enough light to kind of work all the way there. Again, we're not sure what is the distance, see, between the bride's home and the groom's home. A lot of this is left to your imagination, our imagination, as we hear this particular parable. Some now kind of want to, as we move, and suggested that we allegorize this a little bit. What is the light that is shown? Well, for those who might hear this in a Christological or Christian way, the light equals the good deeds that are visible to others and that lead to the praise of God. So that is the light that we bear. It also explains why the 5 wise young women can't share their goods with the foolish women. Why? Because if the light is something that one does, that a person gives, you can't really share that. That is something that needs to come internally from the person. And so that's another way in which some have kind of justified what the wise say to the unwise. Now, usually they're called foolish, but don't you like that dull-witted kind of way of understanding them? If they are young, they still have not yet learned the ways of the world, and that might be why they acted the way they did. So you can see this is an interesting parable as it is narrated to us. A quick word about the first reading, which comes from the book of Wisdom. We have noticed this before. It was a work written perhaps between the years 150 before Jesus' time, so very close to it. Would have been written in the city of Alexandria, which is in Egypt. And this work strove to assure Judeans that their ancient tradition was in no way inferior to the teaching of the Greeks. So that's a little background for this book. The wisdom represents Jewish thought, and living in a culture that was now Hellenistic, the writer wants to show that the kind of wisdom that the book of wisdom gives is just as good, and in some cases maybe even better than the Hellenistic. The wisdom works are often, you remember, ascribed to Solomon, who was the son of David and was known in the tradition as the wise one. In this way, the book of wisdom reminds the readers that true wisdom is always to be found in the Lord, that it is to be a partner with Yahweh, with God, that Israel is called to be. So in that sense, and you really got to stretch it a little bit, they are, that is, the readers of wisdom, to bear the light of God also in their lives into the world. So this is a very beautiful parable here of the welcomers. Again, going back to what we mentioned at the very beginning, the importance is to be vigilant, to be watchful, to be attentive for the coming of the bridegroom. And of course, in our Christian tradition, very often in the scripture, Jesus is described as the bridegroom. So be attentive to the coming of the Lord. This day and all days is the wisdom of the Scripture this time. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.